2,000 horsepower. The words froze everyone in the hangar. Oberleutnant Schulz kept his hand on the cylinder head, feeling the faint warmth still bleeding from the captured American engine. Around him, German mechanics, men who had built Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, stared at the gleaming machine in stunned silence. It wasn't a prototype. It wasn't even damaged. It was standard issue. He looked at the tag on the block. Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp, 18 cylinders. 2 rows of 9, 2,000 horsepower. And in that instant, Schulz understood something he would never write in his report. Germany had already lost the war. It just hadn't realized it yet. Rewind 12 hours. Occupied France, August 1943. A message reached Jagdgeschwader 26's forward airfield. A P-47 Thunderbolt had been forced down, its pilot captured, the aircraft largely intact. The Luftwaffe called it a triumph of intelligence. Schulz called it an experiment waiting for dissection. For months, pilots had mocked this newcomer, an overweight brute they nicknamed Der Fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. It was twice the mass of their FW-190s, ungainly, overbuilt, absurd. On the runway, it looked more factory than fighter. But Schulz wasn't a pilot. He was an engineer from Messerschmitt. Numbers, tolerances, stress curves. He didn't care how it looked. He cared what it meant. When the Thunderbolt arrived under guard, he circled it slowly, notebook in hand. Every surface screamed excess. The barrel-thick fuselage, the monstrous propeller, the armor-lined cockpit. Yet each panel fit with mathematical precision. This wasn't chaos. It was confidence made of metal. He ordered the cowling removed. The laughter died instantly. The engine filled the hangar like a cathedral organ. Polished fins, flawless symmetry, exhaust ducts braided through the fuselage in a pattern of deliberate complexity. The Americans hadn't hidden power behind design. They had built design around power. Schulz's pencil moved fast. Displacement, 46 liters. Compression, 6.65.1. Turbo feed, visible aft of cylinders. He whispered, 2,000 horsepower. The mechanic beside him stared. Not possible with air cooling. Schulz only smiled thinly. It is, if you can afford to build it perfectly. He didn't know it yet, but what waited behind that engine, the turbo-supercharger maze, would reveal a truth more terrifying than any weapon. That America's real advantage wasn't genius or luck. It was industry itself. The cowling lay on the floor like a discarded mask. The face beneath was precision. And Schulz had only begun to understand what he was seeing. The engineers expected to find chaos, pipes, soot, and crude improvisation behind the radial monster. Instead, what they uncovered looked like a machine designed by mathematicians. As the panels came away, the hangar filled with the smell of hot aluminum and oil. Underneath, a maze of ducts twisted like arteries through the fuselage, wide exhaust pipes narrowing into precision-machined channels that disappeared toward the tail. Schulz followed one with his finger, tracing the pattern. It didn't end at the firewall as German designs did. It kept going, down the length of the aircraft. At the far end, near the tail wheel, his assistant stopped and stared. Herr Oberleutnant, there's a turbine back here. Schulz crouched beside it. The realization hit like cold air. The Americans had done what German industry had called impossible. They had fitted a turbo-supercharger inside a single-engine fighter, and not as an experiment, but as standard equipment. The principle was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Exhaust gases drove the turbine at over 20,000 revolutions per minute, compressing thin, high-altitude air and forcing it back into the cylinders. The result? Full sea-level power at 30,000 feet. For a Luftwaffe engineer, it was heresy. Their BMW 801 engines gasped above 25,000 feet, throttled by the limits of mechanical superchargers. The Americans had solved it by sheer industrial audacity. Heat-resistant alloys, precision bearings, perfectly balanced impellers. All of it demanded the kind of mass production Germany could only dream of. Schulz's team ran the numbers. Compressor speed, 20,000 RPM. Duct length, 7 meters. Pressure recovery, 96%. He exhaled slowly. Do you understand what this means? The mechanic frowned. Better high-altitude power? Schulz shook his head. It means they can fight where we can't even breathe. He imagined a formation of Thunderbolts climbing above 30,000 feet. Heavy, but unstoppable. Engines still roaring while German fighters sputtered in thin air. The P-47's true weapon wasn't its guns or armor. It was its oxygen advantage. He scribbled a note for his report. System efficiency suggests U.S. mastery of high-temperature metallurgy. Precision machining beyond current German tolerance levels. Not reproducible with available materials. It was a sentence that felt like treason. His assistant broke the silence. If we cannot copy it, perhaps we can destroy it. Schulz looked up, eyes distant. You don't destroy an idea. You outproduce it. And we can't. For a moment, the hangar seemed to shrink. The massive American engine stood gleaming under the floodlights, half dissected, still magnificent, a symbol of an enemy that built machines not for elegance, but for endurance. As they replaced the panels, Schulz caught his reflection in the polished cowl. The face staring back was pale, his uniform marked with oil and fear. He had come to study a machine. Instead, he had found a mirror of defeat. By the time Schulz finished cataloging the turbo-supercharger, the sun had sunk behind the hangar windows, and the air smelled of iron dust and frustration. His clipboard was heavy with numbers, but every line whispered the same truth. The Reich could not replicate what it saw. He gathered his team around the stripped Thunderbolt. This, he said, gesturing to the massive engine assembly, requires tolerances of 0.002 of a millimeter. That means precision bearings, high-grade aluminum, nickel-chromium alloys, all manufactured in factories free from bombing, with skilled laborers who aren't starving. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Everyone in that hangar knew the state of German industry in 1943. Skilled machinists drafted into infantry, power plants rationed, the once proud Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf plants forced to cut corners, thinner alloys, simplified parts, lower-grade fuels. Schulz opened his notebook. Look here, see this turbine blade? That's heat-treated Inconel, stable past 800 degrees Celsius. We have nothing that can match it. Ours crack at 600. One mechanic muttered, then we'll improvise. Schulz slammed the notebook shut. Improvisation doesn't spin at 20,000 revolutions per minute. Silence. Only the ticking of the cooling metal. He knew the problem wasn't courage or intellect. It was scale. America had designed a system where factories fed factories. Ball-bearing plants in Illinois, supplying engine lines in Connecticut, aluminum smelters in Oregon powering airframe assembly in New York. Germany's network was crumbling under bombs. Every success on the Eastern Front meant another plant lost at home. Schulz turned toward the tail section, studying the repair panels. The aircraft had been shot to pieces and still landed. Look at this, he said quietly. 20-millimeter holes, yet the control cables are doubled. Redundant hydraulics, self-sealing tanks, armored bulkheads. They built this as if they expected it to take damage every flight and keep fighting. His assistant nodded reluctantly. Over-engineered. Yes, Schulz replied, but they can afford to over-engineer. They have engines powerful enough to lift the weight. We design for perfection because we have no margin. They design for survival because they have too much of it. He stared at the Thunderbolt's 8 Browning .50 caliber guns, the thick ammunition belts curling through each wing. Thousands of rounds, each bullet perfectly crimped, lacquer sealed against moisture. They even manufacture bullets like machines, he murmured. Nothing wasted. Nothing improvised, one of the younger engineers, eyes hollow from ration fatigue, asked. Herr Oberleutnant, what do we write in the report? Schulz hesitated. The truth would sound like defeatism, but lies would change nothing. We tell them exactly what we found, and we pray someone listens. He turned off the floodlight. The engine's polished casing caught the last sliver of dusk, glowing like something alive. Tomorrow, his report would go to Berlin. Tonight, he understood what it would mean to send it. Berlin wanted proof, not poetry. Schulz knew that as his report traveled up the chain, through adjutants, staff officers, and eventually to the Air Ministry, his numbers would either be believed or buried. So he made them undeniable. He filled the report with ratios, charts, and production figures that made even hardened officers pale. Republic Aviation, he wrote, was producing 500 P-47 Thunderbolts every month, with plans to reach 800 by mid-1944. The Pratt and Whitney factories had already built over 40,000 R-2800 engines, each a 2,000-horsepower masterpiece. For comparison, every plant in the Reich, Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, combined could barely produce 300 fighters total per month, many using engines a generation behind. The more he wrote, the colder he felt. The numbers were not statistics. They were artillery shells. Each one exploded a myth, the myth of German superiority, of technical parity, of a war that could still be won by willpower alone. At the staff meeting in Lille, the officers read in silence. When Schulz finished, one colonel leaned back and muttered, "Propaganda! These figures come from American boasts." Schulz met his gaze. "I measured the engine myself. I touched it. Their boasts are flying over our cities." Another officer snorted. "Then we must build faster." "With what?" Schulz snapped. "We're melting church bells for copper. They're building aircraft hangars the size of cities." The colonel's face hardened. "Your tone sounds defeatist." "My tone," Schulz said evenly, "is the sound of mathematics." He was dismissed without ceremony. The report was forwarded to Berlin, then vanished into the bureaucratic fog. Weeks later, through a friend in the Ministry of Armaments, Schulz learned what had happened. His analysis was labeled overly pessimistic, his calculations influenced by Allied exaggeration. The Luftwaffe would continue fighting within existing parameters. He didn't know whether to laugh or weep, because by autumn, those parameters were collapsing. The Thunderbolts were multiplying. They filled the skies over France in glittering swarms, escorting bombers at altitudes where German interceptors could barely climb, diving like meteors through contrails. Pilots who once mocked them now whispered of them as ghosts above the clouds, their engines still roaring at heights that starved BMWs into silence. Every encounter confirmed the numbers. Each new squadron, each lost airfield, each burning Me-109 was another equation solved by American industry. Schulz began keeping a second notebook, private, unsanctioned. No tables, no graphs, just thoughts. "We are not losing to pilots," he wrote. "We are losing to factories. The P-47 is not an aircraft. It is the sound of a continent at full power." He closed the book and set it beside the captured engine still stored under guard. The war was no longer about tactics or bravery. It was about arithmetic, and the math was merciless. By October 1943, the skies above Western Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the noise. A new kind of thunder rolled across the stratosphere, metallic and endless, as squadrons of P-47s escorted bomber streams so vast they blotted out the sun. From the ground, Schulz could hear them before he saw them. Low, steady, mechanical. Not the sharp growl of a piston at its limits, but the smooth, confident roar of an engine cruising at power levels his country couldn't dream of sustaining. He had stopped hoping Berlin would respond to his report. He still received memoranda stamped Technische Bewertung, demanding analysis of captured fragments. A propeller hub from a Thunderbolt shot down near Rouen, a supercharger casing found in a crash near Le Havre. Every piece told the same story. Abundance. Each part machined to a perfection that no war-stricken factory could equal. When he toured the Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen that month, the contrast made him ill. The factory floor was dim, the machinery worn, its operators underfed teenagers and old men. Spare parts were cannibalized from wrecks, copper wiring replaced with steel, aluminum with wood. Engineers spoke of substitutions, as if vocabulary could hide the decay. One night, during an inspection, Schulz found a fitter trying to align a warped cylinder head with a wooden mallet. The man looked up, embarrassed. "We do what we can, Herr Oberleutnant. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to fly once." That sentence haunted him. It just has to fly once. At the front, German pilots were being trained in half the time and sent up in machines that barely met design tolerances. The Thunderbolts they faced could climb higher, dive faster, take more punishment, and return again and again. Schulz's colleagues tried to preserve professional detachment, but the silence after each briefing told the truth. They were running out of material, out of manpower, out of margin. And now, for the first time, Schulz felt something he had never allowed himself to feel in war. Shame. Not for losing, but for pretending they weren't. He reread the conclusion of his forbidden notebook. The P-47 is not a weapon of genius, but of infrastructure. That was its secret. Not design brilliance, but the will to build endlessly, perfectly, until quantity became quality. The next morning, as news arrived of another failed interception over Bremen, 6 FW-190s lost for no confirmed kills, Schulz stood by the hangar doors watching contrails form 10 kilometers above. He could just make out the faint dots of escorting fighters. He knew their shape now by instinct. Broad wings, short fuselage, propellers like spinning discs of light. Someone beside him whispered, "They'll run out of them eventually." Schulz didn't answer. He knew the truth. They never run out. In Berlin, the speeches still promised victory. On the radio, the voices of the Reich spoke of new wonder weapons, jets, rockets, miracles. But, in the hangars of occupied France, Oberleutnant Schulz had already seen the truth that no propaganda could drown out. The real war wasn't being fought in the skies. It was being fought in the factories. He saw it in every captured machine that arrived for analysis. A C-47 transport. Perfect rivet spacing, flawless welds, hydraulic systems so refined they could run for years without service. A B-17's electrical harness labeled in color-coded circuits, each connection identical to every other built that month. This was industrial rhythm, not invention. Each aircraft was a line in a symphony of production. The Reich had engineers. America had engineers multiplied by millions. The pattern repeated everywhere he looked. American carburetors used alloys that Germany reserved for armor plate. Their spark plugs lasted twice as long. Their lubricants stayed stable at temperatures that burned through German oils in minutes. Each small advantage was invisible in isolation, but together they formed an empire of momentum. Schulz began to understand that the P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was evidence, proof of an industrial civilization that could turn theory into metal overnight. Every American plane captured was a message. This is what abundance looks like. He tried to explain this in a private memo to his superior, Oberst Feldman. "We are measuring airplanes," he wrote, "but what we are truly measuring is civilization itself." Feldman returned it without comment. except for a single line scrawled across the margin. Then we have already lost. That night, as Schulz reviewed the latest Luftwaffe loss reports, he realized how literal that note had become. Fighter strength across the Western Front was dropping by the week. Pilots were being replaced faster than engines could be built. Entire Gruppen existed only on paper. He ran the numbers again. Production rates, sortie counts, loss ratios. The pattern was identical to the one he had drawn from the P-47 engine months earlier. Precision X scale, X time, 600 inevitability. It was the same formula that powered the double Wasp. Compress air, increase density, multiply force. The Americans had done the same to industry itself. He looked at the map on the wall. Arrows pushing inward from every direction. The Reich was being compressed, heated, overloaded, and like any engine beyond its limits, it was about to fail catastrophically. Schulz closed his notebook. The engineers had done their job. They had revealed the truth. But no one in Berlin would listen, because no one wanted to admit that the war they were losing wasn't about bravery or tactics. It was about who could build faster than the other could bleed. January 11th, 1944. Snow drifted across the runways of northern France as the sirens wailed. Schulz looked up from his drafting table and saw what the Luftwaffe officers had begun calling der schwarze Himmel, the black sky. It wasn't black from weather. It was black from bombers. Wave after wave of B-17s and B-24s thundered eastward toward the Ruhr, flanked by the same broad-winged escorts whose engines he had dissected months earlier. The Thunderbolts, hundreds of them. The real power of America now arrived not as theory on paper, but as a sound that never stopped. The first German interceptors clawed upward, leaving white trails against the winter haze. Schulz tracked them with his binoculars until they vanished into the contrails, tiny silhouettes against an endless wall of moving metal. Moments later came the flashes, tiny orange bursts, and then tumbling dots. Fighters falling. He didn't need a radio report to know what was happening. He could almost recite it from memory. Climbed to 28,000 feet. Engines losing power. Could not reach bombers. Thunderbolts diving from above. The very system he had described in his suppressed report was unfolding over his head. The Thunderbolts dominated the altitude bands where German aircraft suffocated. Their R-2800s, fed by those impossible turbo-superchargers, still delivered full power above the clouds. The Luftwaffe's mechanical superchargers gasped and died. He watched an FW-190 try to dive away, chased by a silver blur that fell like a meteor. In seconds, the German fighter burst into flame and disintegrated. A distant pop reached his ears a heartbeat later, the echo of the P-47's 8 Browning 50s. No one around him spoke. Even the anti-aircraft crews had stopped shouting coordinates. They just watched. When the formations finally turned west, the sky was full of falling ash. Burned oil, shredded aluminum, fragments of uniforms. The smoke trailed north toward the Channel, toward the factories that would already be building replacements for the American machines lost that morning. Schulz returned to his desk and opened his notebook again. He drew a single line across the page, a diagonal descending into nothing. Underneath, he wrote, "After today, we will never own the sky again." That night, at the officers' mess, the pilots were silent. One of them, eyes rimmed red, stared into his drink and whispered, "We hit one. It didn't even fall. Just rolled, leveled, and came back." Another laughed hollowly. "Maybe God flies for them now." Schulz didn't join the conversation. He knew it wasn't divinity keeping those aircraft aloft. It was metallurgy, mathematics, and an industrial rhythm that no amount of faith could overcome. The day the Thunderbolts filled the sky, Germany's last illusion died with them, the belief that courage could outclimb capacity. In the weeks following that raid, the war changed from struggle to inevitability. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe was no longer a shield. It was a casualty. By February, Allied bombers roamed the daylight skies almost unopposed. At night, the glow of burning cities reached the clouds. Schulz's airfield received fragments of news from the front. Interceptors lost before they reached formation altitude. Squadrons wiped out. Fuel trains destroyed by Thunderbolt strafing runs. The numbers that had once been neat columns in his reports were now human. Pilots' names scratched from rosters. Mechanics transferred to units that no longer existed. When a truck arrived one morning carrying wreckage from an FW-190, Schulz hardly recognized it as an aircraft. The engine block was half melted, armor scorched black. The recovery sergeants spat into the snow. They were hit on approach. P-47s, again, came down like hawks, 8 guns each. Not one survivor. Schulz knelt by the wreck and touched the twisted propeller hub. The metal was pitted, brittle, the alloy poor. He remembered how the American blades had gleamed under the hangar lights, perfectly balanced, their cores forged from rare nickel steel that his factories could no longer afford. He no longer took notes. There was nothing left to record that mattered. In March, orders came. The testing detachment was to evacuate to Germany. Allied fighters were striking even inland depots. The Thunderbolts, once mocked as clumsy, were now bombing rail yards, bridges, convoys, every artery that fed the Reich. The sound of their engines haunted the roads, that deep rhythmic thunder that German soldiers called Donnerschlag, thunderclap. As Schulz's convoy drove east, he saw the aftermath of their work. Shattered locomotives still smoking by the tracks, convoys reduced to skeletons of steel, villages flattened by fighter-bomber runs. Each ruin was proof of an equation he had written months before: production multiplied by precision equals annihilation. At a refueling stop near Cologne, he spoke with a wounded flak officer who had manned the 88s. "They come too fast now," the man said, coughing smoke. "Too many. You hit one, 5 more. They kill our guns first. They know exactly where we are." "Of course they do," Schulz answered quietly. "They have the fuel to fly for hours. They can search, observe, strike again. We barely get off the ground." That night he slept in the back of the truck beside boxes of salvaged engine parts. The rhythmic hum of distant bombing filled the air like a heartbeat. For a moment he imagined it wasn't war. It was industry itself, alive and advancing. When dawn came, a thin layer of soot covered everything. He brushed it from his uniform, but it clung to the fabric, dark and fine. It would not come off. By spring 1944, Schulz's predictions had stopped being warnings and become headlines. The phrases from his own report reappeared in the Air Ministry's dispatches: unsustainable losses, numerical superiority, high-altitude dominance. But now they carried no authorship, no admission. They were simply reality. He no longer worked at the front. The detachment had been absorbed into a research bureau near Kassel, a collection of engineers assigned to analyze enemy aircraft technology for potential adaptation. What adaptation could there be when factories were rubble? He spent his days drafting schematics for engines that would never be built, listening to the rumble of distant bombers through the windows. Every few weeks, a new captured component arrived. Fragments of a P-51 propeller, a burned-out magneto from a B-24, a section of American oxygen tubing. Each one felt like an artifact from another civilization, one that had continued evolving while his own regressed. One evening he was called to brief a visiting staff officer from the Luftwaffe's planning division. The man flipped through Schulz's old reports and stopped at a line highlighted in red pencil. The P-47 represents an industrial sophistication that exceeds Germany's capabilities. The officer looked up. "Do you still stand by this statement?" Schulz studied the man's pristine uniform. the unlined hands of someone who had never touched a lathe. "I don't stand by it," he said quietly. "I live inside it," the officer frowned, closing the folder. "You engineers have no faith. This war is not lost yet. We have new weapons coming. The jet, the rocket, the V-weapons," Schulz interrupted softly. "And how many can you build?" There was no answer. The conversation ended there. That night, Schulz returned to his bunk and opened the same worn notebook he had carried since France. Its last page was still blank. He hesitated, then wrote the only thing left to say. "The war we thought we were fighting ended the day we saw that engine." Outside, the sirens began again. The airfield lights went dark as the bombers approached. Through the window he could see the horizon flicker, orange blossoms rising from factories, from homes, from what remained of the Reich's industrial heart. He thought of the P-47 engine he had first examined, of its perfect tolerances, its endless replication, and realized the ultimate irony. The machine that had proven Germany's defeat was still flying, somewhere above those fires, its descendants multiplying faster than the flames could destroy them. For the first time in months, he felt something like peace. The numbers had never lied. The enemy had not conquered through brilliance, but through discipline, patience, and the machinery of democracy. He closed the notebook, folded his hands, and whispered to the empty room, "Perhaps this is how a civilization ends. Not with surrender, but with recognition." Outside, the bombers passed. The night was quiet again. May 1945. Silence. For the first time in 6 years, the skies over Germany held no contrails, no drone of engines, no thunder of bombs. The war was over. What remained was metal, twisted, burned, abandoned in fields like relics from another species. Schulz stood beside a scrap heap near Kassel, his uniform stripped of insignia, his authority meaningless. Around him, Allied recovery crews catalogued wreckage for salvage. A young American mechanic, his hands still black with oil, pulled a tarp from a piece of machinery. Beneath it gleamed the unmistakable fins of a Pratt & Whitney R-2800. "Still runs," the mechanic said proudly. "Took it out of a P-47 that belly-landed last week." "Engine never quit." Schulz stepped closer. Even now, after the bombing, the famine, the collapse, the sight of that engine drew him in. The design had not changed. The lines were still perfect, the tolerances precise. 2,000 horsepower of proof. He smiled faintly. "You built them too well," he murmured in English. The mechanic glanced at him, unsure if he had heard a compliment or a confession. "We built a lot of them," he said simply, and turned back to his work. That sentence stayed with Schulz. "We built a lot of them." It wasn't arrogance. It was the calm statement of a nation that had won by repetition, not rhetoric. The P-47 had been many things: fighter, escort, tank buster, but to Schulz, it was something larger, a symbol of industrial democracy, the power of millions of anonymous hands guided by one belief, that precision and patience could be as decisive as courage. Years later, when he found work in a civilian factory rebuilding farm equipment, he kept a small photograph on his bench, the captured Thunderbolt, the day they had lifted its cowling. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Sometimes the younger mechanics would ask, "Was it really that good?" Schulz would nod slowly. Yes, it was that good. But what made it great wasn't the metal. It was the world that built it. He would pause, glance toward the windows, and add quietly, "A world that knew how to make perfection ordinary." Outside, the countryside hummed with the sound of new machines, tractors, trains, trucks, all powered by the same lineage of engineering that had once terrified him. The thunder he had feared had become the pulse of peace. He realized then that the P-47's legacy wasn't destruction. It was endurance, the idea that complexity could serve purpose, that strength could protect as well as destroy. He took one last look at the photograph before turning off the light. The image was fading, its edges yellowed, but the engine still gleamed. The war had ended. The lesson had not. They thought it was grotesque. It never was.